Everybody. I'm Christy Rubenstein with Diana T. Myers and Associates. I'm going to share a PowerPoint and get us going. Okay, hopefully folks can see that. And
yep, we can see it.
Great. I am going to admit that there's a lot going on my screen, so I'm going to leave it to Erin and the crew at AHAD to monitor the chat while I talk, and they're more than capable of responding to questions that might come up. So the purpose of my presentation, as Erin said, was really is to go through an overview of the CoC funding policies and the Renewal project sort of scoring tools, and to just kind of give you a sense of the broad scope of things, and then we can answer any questions that come up. And I believe everybody has had access to this information for a little while, so hopefully you've had a chance to look at it. If you have any questions saved up, maybe we'll answer them, or you can get them answered along the way. So in terms of the topics to be covered, I'll just give like a very brief background for the CoC sort of competition, and then talk a little bit about those CoC funding policies and highlighting some of the changes from last year to this year. I'll talk very briefly about the Renewal project application because Erin's going to go over that in more detail. And then I will talk about the scoring tool and the criteria. Again, we will be able to take questions. There are some pauses throughout, but you can feel free to use the chat box. And if you have a question though that you'd rather ask, feel free to use like the raise hand feature or whatever to let us know, and we can take your questions along the way. In the meantime, just request everybody stay muted so that we don't hear any background noise on your side or any conversations that you might not want us to hear. All right, so in terms of background on the CoC program, just sort of for those who might be new to this, a little less familiar, the CoC really is called upon by HUD to evaluate CoC funded renewal projects as part of the CoC program competition, NOFO, which stands for Notice of Funding Opportunity. And that happens typically annually, although that might be changing. We'll talk about that in the future. Just to note that, again, this is really part of HUD's requirements as part of the NOFO. HUD pushes CoCs also to use a data-driven and non-conflicted approach. So you'll see that reflected both in sort of the CoCs, the criteria that are used, and also we have a whole section in the funding policies about conflicts of interest and sort of how to maintain a non-conflicted approach throughout the process. HUD also scores CoCs on the criteria that are used to evaluate renewal projects. So HUD in the CoC program NOFO each year says, hey CoCs, here's the kind of stuff we want to see you use, and we're going to award your CoC points or not based on whether you do this. And so that's part of the reason why the CoC's criteria kind of look and feel the way they do sometimes, because HUD's really pushing for certain areas to be covered as part of the evaluation. And that includes the use of objective criteria. So they really want CoCs to limit the subjectiveness of the evaluation. They want to see at least 33% of the points go for the objective criteria. You're well above that, which is good. Use of system performance related criteria has to be at least 20% of the points. They also want to see that CoCs account for the severity of need of or the barriers faced by your project's participants when we're evaluating your projects. They also want to assess how quickly projects place participants in permanent housing. It's a very big deal for HUD. And also for the CoC, right? Getting folks into housing quickly. DV providers must be evaluated using data from a comparable database. And then this HUD is also pushing CoCs to evaluate projects and agencies on whether they identify and address barriers to participation faced by persons of different races and ethnicities. So you see that reflected in some of the criteria that are used. And then we also have to look at assessing cost effectiveness and involving people of different races and ethnicities and people with lived experience of homelessness in the rating and ranking process. So all of these things are things that the CoC gets evaluated on. And so you will see those reflected in the criteria that are used. For background, because I do think we have maybe some new folks, I'm going to be using some of these terms. I just wanted to I use this slide to explain like what the CoC has to submit. And that is something called the consolidated application. So when HUD releases that CoC program NOFO, they'll also open up a system called eSnaps, which some of you may have been in, and the CoC has to complete two parts really of this application and submit each. One part is the CoC application, and that's where the CoC answers a bunch of questions and has to, all the things that were on that, the CoC evaluates projects, has to submit all this information to HUD to show like this is what we used. The other part is the priority list, and that's how all of your renewal project applications get submitted. And so the CoC is supposed to submit both of these in order for the application to be considered complete. That I'm going to use the term priority list, and I'll probably talk about the CoC application. So just don't want folks who are unfamiliar to be a little bit lost when I use these terms. The priority list is the list of all the applications that are getting submitted, and all applications have to be rated and ranked, except for the planning grant. So that's part of the reason why we go through this whole process of evaluating projects, and then that helps us to rank the projects, which we have to do. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the funding policies, and again, not get into like lots of the details. You can read those yourselves, but I'm going to point out some of the sort of big picture stuff and some of the changes that have been made. So the funding policies cover sort of a wide range of areas. These are all the sort of different sections of the funding policies document. There's a background section, a funding process overview, talk about roles and responsibilities, conflicts of interest, which I mentioned already. There's a section on renewal project application, evaluation, and scoring policies, very specific to the work that you all are going to be involved in. Then we have the new project solicitation, evaluation, and scoring policies, reallocation policies, ranking policy, appeals policy, and quality improvement policy. So all of that is in one document. It used to be in many different documents a few years ago, and then the CoC sort of made an effort to pull everything into one document so that everything would be in sort of one consolidated place, easier for everyone to understand what the policies were and what was being used. As part of doing that, things got consolidated, and then we went through several years of revisions since then to sort of, update those policies, improve the flow, streamline them, reduce redundancy, and to make changes in the process as needed, in order to reflect sort of what the CoC's practice actually is typically. Last year, I'll say that after several years of sort of revisions, there was an effort to streamline, reduce, the content a little bit and the redundancy. And we also added a new section on how the CoC should review infrastructure project applications for system level projects like HMIS and SSOCE. And then this year, very few changes, a lot of just revisions to language and clarifications of language. So feeling like they're in good shape. And so just really working on making sure that all the language is clear and things are clearly explained. Changes, this is just a big picture overview of changes. We have a bunch of sections where there were no changes at all. Definitions, background, funding process overview, some minimal changes to roles and responsibilities. I'll talk through that. Conflict of interest, I'll touch upon the change there. There's renewal project application, evaluation, and scoring policies. We'll talk a little bit about those changes. Again, these are all pretty like minor changes on the edges, really, nothing big or substantial. The new project solicitation, evaluation, and scoring policies, I'm not really going to talk about, doesn't apply to, the renewal project evaluation process. The change here, I'll just note, is around whether the CoC, like who's going to develop the selection recommendations, and that's just clarifying that that's coming from the funding committee for the non-conflicted board approval. And that's really the bulk of the change there. We also added in a section, a language requiring if HUD is going to request additional funds for HMIS or SSOCE projects, that they provide a narrative explaining the urgency of the need. So that's the main change there. Then I'll touch base on reallocation policies, although there are no changes. Of course, that's of interest to all of you who have renewal projects. Just in case you're interested in reallocating, or there's an involuntary reallocation, so you understand what the policies are. Ranking policy, appeals policy, and quality improvement policy, we'll touch upon all of those as well, and only a minor change to the revision policy to show there were revisions. All right, I did want to touch upon the roles and responsibilities, just to be clear that each sort of group that works on this process as a whole, the policies do talk about sort of what their roles and responsibilities are. So if you're wondering sort of like, what is the role of the funding committee? What does the non-conflicted board do, right? All of that is spelled out within these policies. And so just to be clear that the funding committee takes on sort of a detailed review of a lot of the documents and tools and information. And for the most part, they're sort of making recommendations that go on to the non-conflicted board, and the non-conflicted board's role is to review those things and to make sort of final determinations of many of the different elements of this process. So in terms of what the funding committee does, they review and approve the funding policies and make recommendations to the non-conflicted board. They do the review and approval of the CoC project applications and scoring tools, including the tools that we're going to go over today. They also will do the sort of deep dive in terms of the evaluation outcomes and scores. They will meet and they will go through a lot of the narratives that you write as part of your application, the things that are scored, and they will work on scoring your responses. That information gets then sent along to the non-conflicted board in terms of project selection, reallocation, and ranking recommendations, right? So they're going to make those recommendations over to the non-conflicted board, and they will determine what projects to place on quality improvement. And then they will also meet out with HUD not present to evaluate the centralized intake and HMIS projects annually. The non-conflicted board's role is to review and approve the funding committee membership, review and approve the funding policies that are recommended by the funding committee. They review the final project scores and recommendations for the selection, reallocation, and ranking of projects that are developed by the funding committee. They review and make final determinations on appeals. Appeals do not go to the funding committee. Appeals go to the non-conflicted board. And because of this, there were some clarifications in the language here about sort of who makes the final determination. Well, the funding committee will make the final determination, say, on your renewal project score. If an agency appeals, it will ultimately be up to the non-conflicted board, right, to finalize that score. And so they get final determination on all of those things. And then they will review and approve the annual consolidated application that gets submitted to HUD for funding. So the language changes that were in here were just clarifying that the funding committee is sending sort of like final, like sort of scores over to the non-conflicted board, but the non-conflicted board has final say. because they are the ones who make determinations around appeals. The CoC lead also has a list of their roles and responsibilities. So that, of course, is Housing Alliance Delaware. So if you're wondering what they are supposed to be doing, what their role is in this process, that's all listed out in the funding policy as well. And essentially they're charged with just making sure that the application gets submitted and that all of the parts of the application come together, right? So coordinate and execute all the activities to submit the application and the project applications, manage the funding process, and make sure you meet HUD's NOFO timelines for the competition, drafting the funding policies and the project applications and scoring tools for review and approval by the committee, ultimately for the policies, but also by the non-conflicted board, coordinate and manage the submission, review, and evaluation and preliminary scoring of all the project applications, ensure the accuracy of all HUD application information for your applications, and then ensure that the CoC meets all the requirements under the program NOFO, drafting the consolidated application on behalf of the CoC and submitting that to the board for approval, and applying for CoC planning, and then administering the quality improvement plan process. So HUD has their own tasks to take care of. I'll talk a bit about the conflict of interest policy. There was like a sort of minor change here to close a loophole. But in general, right, the conflict of interest policy is meant to set out the rules around sort of who can participate in this process, because we want to avoid any situations where an agency has undue influence, right, on the process for which they are applying for funds, or planning to apply for funds, already received funds. So if you are a CoC funded agency or anticipate applying for CoC program funds, you're really not supposed to be participating in the process, because that would be sort of unfair, right? An unfair advantage. So that's really what the conflict of interest policy is all about. There is a section in there that sort of allows other funders to participate in the process. And the clarification that was added was just to say, like, sure, you can participate in the process unless you are receiving CoC program funds, and then you're not really supposed to participate in this process. But we wanted to make sure that just because another agency is funding a project does not mean that representatives from those agencies are excluded from participating as a funding committee member or on the non-conflicted board. Again, it's really about if you're receiving funding yourself. And then, or if you have someone with an interest, right, an immediate family member or business tie. So that's all sort of laid out in the conflict of interest policy. What's also established is a funding committee chair in collaboration with the non-conflicted board and consultants is responsible for coordinating the funding process related to the CoC leads funded projects. So that's HAD, and that's really the HMIS and SSOCE projects. They can't be a part of that, actual evaluation process because they are conflicted. And then all CoC board and funding committee members have to sort of annually complete a form that list sort of talks about whether they have a conflict or not. And throughout the process, if a conflict were to arise, it's their obligation to report that. All right, let's talk a little bit about renewal project applications, evaluations, and scoring. There's a whole section in the funding policies. If you haven't read it or you're wondering about it, feel free to read through it. It does lay out sort of a bunch of useful information for you as applicants. And the main thing is it goes through sort of the factors that will be considered as part of the evaluation. And that includes HUD and CoC threshold requirements. There's compliance with HUD and CoC rules, regulations, and standards. We'll also consider project and system performance, and then alignment with HUD and Delaware CoC needs and priorities. So those are all things stated as like these are going to be parts of the sort of evaluation of your renewal projects. The scoring tool development itself, there's also sort of a process that's laid out there. And that includes reviewing of grantee debriefs. So when HAD comes to you and does a debrief, all of that information kind of gets compiled and shared and helps influence the next scoring tool. We also do a data analysis looking at the point structures and also the evaluation data to inform benchmarks, to ensure that the benchmarks are set too high or too low, that they're achievable, that the point structures make sense in terms of do they reflect the things that the CoC wants to weight the most, and that's a reflection of the CoC's priorities, of course. That information gets presented to the funding committee for discussion and then finalization of the tools. And then the tools are publicly shared and distributed to all of you as grantees. And then we commence with the evaluation and scoring process. So the evaluation scoring process itself includes a data cleanup period, which I believe you all are in or has recently closed. And then we do the evaluation launch, which is today. And then at the same time, applications have already been made available, but you'll be working on those and submitting them. That information, once you submit your applications, those get reviewed by the CoC lead and then the funding committee, and they will sit and complete the scoring, particularly of the narrative portions. Also meet to discuss reallocation and potential quality improvement plan placement. That information will inform the funding committee's recommendations, which are sent to the non-conflicted board. And then you all are notified of your scores, and there is an appeal option. The section in the document also covers approval of consolidations and briefly touches on expansions. So if you're interested in a consolidation or expansion, you can also read through that part of the policies to make sure you understand what your options are. In terms of changes to this sections, there was some additional language around first time and second time renewals, and that is because we are aware that HUD's contracting timeline is not ideal for our new projects. So the CoC's long time sort of stance has been that first time renewals are not evaluated because the project's not up and running. However, more and more because of the late contracting, second time renewals are also not fully operating for the entirety of the year. And so the language really just allows for the funding committee to make a determination if a second time renewal should be evaluated. There's also clarifying language around final renewal project scoring being sent to the funding committee, sent by the funding committee to the non-conflicted board, separate from really very specifically the ranking. So those things don't have to all happen at once. So it's just clarification in the language there. And then updated language around the project notification and public postings and making sure that they are aligned with HUD's NOFO timelines and meeting those deadlines. Reallocation policy, wanted to cover this, although no changes here, to make sure that folks are aware of what reallocation is first and foremost, and under what conditions a project's funds might be reallocated. So reallocation is really the taking of funds from an existing renewal project and putting them toward a new project in some way, shape, or form. And that can happen for many different reasons. First, an agency might decide to voluntarily reallocate funds. This can happen because an agency says, hey, actually, I don't want to do this sort of CoC program stuff anymore. Or they could say, actually, I'm doing a certain type of project and want to do something different or have a different idea. So those are reasons why an agency might approach the CoC about a voluntary reallocation. The policy is that the agency will need to notify the CoC lead agency in writing, stating the amount to be reallocated, because you can reallocate a portion of your funds or all of them. The reasons why you might want to do that and whether you want to put the funds to another use. The CoC lead agency is then going to take that information and provide it to the CoC's non-conflicted board, and they will review and determine the outcome of that request. So the decision-making stays with the non-conflicted board. In terms of an involuntary reallocation, there's a sort of list of reasons over here in blue as to why a project might be involuntary reallocated. That includes failure to meet CoC threshold requirements, poor project system performance, misalignment with HUD policy priorities or the CoC's own priorities, or the needs of those served by the CoC. Or there could be a project that is non-compliant with sort of important HUD or CoC rules, regulations, and requirements. So reallocation, involuntary reallocation is always an option in those cases. The CoC would be having the funding committee essentially would review that information. That's part of what the evaluation teases out, whether there are any of these issues going on. And then the funding committee would make a recommendation to the non-conflicted board around projects that might be reallocated and how much. The non-conflicted board will ultimately be the ones to review those recommendations and make a final determination around whether reallocation should occur. And agencies are provided with the right to appeal a reallocation decision. The use of reallocated funds for a voluntary reallocation, as I mentioned before, the non-conflicted board would review the request. If that agency says, hey, I actually want to put those funds, I want to take them and I want to use them to create another different kind of project, it's up to the board to determine whether they would approve that request or not, or whether the funds would just go into the pot along with all the other new project funds to be distributed. Involuntarily reallocated funds essentially use an RFP process. So typically the existing sort of new project RFP process, it just goes into the pot of new funds to be distributed in that mechanism for anybody who has applied for new project funds through that RFP. So that's the most typical path there. The ranking policy, there was a change, but it was only to the name of the section, which changed from prioritization and ranking policy to ranking policy. Again, we're reducing redundancy. What's on this slide is really just the ranking factors related to renewal projects. There are ranking factors for different types of projects within the policy itself, so you can go read through those if you want. These are the ones specifically related to renewal projects. And that includes the final outcomes and scores from the evaluation that we're about to undertake. Not just the scores and those performance outcomes, but also looking at the threshold requirements, compliance with all the rules, regulations, and requirements, alignment with the CoC's needs and priorities, and then also the performance aspect. So just to be aware that all parts of the information that you're filling out on the application could be included as factors to be used for determining the ranking. There is also consideration of overall competitiveness for CoC funding based on HUD performance measures and policy priorities that are stated in the NOFO itself. And then additional information such as supplemental narratives and attachments would also inform the ranking. And then first-time renewal projects are not eligible for reallocation and will be ranked in Tier 1. So just again, clarifying, if you have a first-time renewal, don't worry, you're not going to be evaluated. Your project's automatically going to go in Tier 1. At the end of the day, the funding committee and the non-conflicted board reserve the right to make ranking decisions as needed to ensure compliance with and competitiveness for HUD CoC funding. That's noted because the ranking rules are a little bit not straightforward, I guess. And there are sometimes considerations really around competitiveness, trying to make sure we bring the most funds as possible to the CoC. HUD has a kind of crazy formula for determining like who will get funded and not. And so the CoC is always looking to try to make sure that the ranking is submitted in a way that allows us to bring in as many dollars as possible to the CoC. The appeal policy. So for renewal projects, you can submit an appeal for project scoring errors, reallocation if you've been reallocated in partial or in full, and then improper application interpretation of HUD CoC rules regulations concerning the participation of the applicant in the CoC application process. The agency will have 3 days from the decision to submit an appeal in writing using the CoC funding appeal form. So once you get your score, you have 3 days. The non-conflicted board then has 7 days to investigate and follow up. And then if there is an appeal that would impact the ranking across the board for everybody, then applicants are notified. But if there is an appeal that would have no impact on the ranking, then we don't necessarily notify everybody. And then agencies that are not satisfied through the CoC's appeals policy can appeal to HUD in accordance with the rules laid out in the NOFO each year. Quality improvement policy. The funding committee will determine which projects to place on a QIP. Again, they're going to look at the evaluation outcomes to assess the sort of whether that's a thing that would be helpful for an agency. HAD is responsible for developing and administering the QIP with the project's leadership and for the ongoing monitoring of the QIP completion. The agency is responsible for implementing the changes needed to address the issues outlined in the QIP. QIP placement and or outcomes can affect project scoring and ranking during subsequent CoC funding competitions. So just be aware if you've been placed on a QIP, you do want to be working on that QIP because it can both impact your ranking ultimately, and also this last bullet, failure to meet one or more of the requirements in the QIP may result in partial or full reallocation of CoC project funds. So take your QIP seriously. All right, I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to take a sip of something to drink. If anybody had any questions or anything came up, or for anyone on the HAD team, if there was anything I didn't touch upon that you wanted to highlight in terms of the funding policies, feel free to speak up. Okay, Aaron's giving me the thumb. I guess we're good. I don't think there were any questions. All right. Now we'll get into the CoC renewal project evaluation application and scoring tools. And we're really going to focus here on the PSH, rapid rehousing, transitional housing, the joint component transitional housing, rapid rehousing, and DV projects. There are scoring tools that are probably going to be posted any day now that the funding committee and I worked with them on developing for the HMIS and SSOCE projects. We're not reviewing those here, but they do exist for anybody who's curious about them, and HAD is going to be completing those. All right, the renewal project application, very briefly, because Aaron's going to go and cover this in more detail. But just so you know, there's a single application for PSH, rapid, transitional housing, and then TH or rapid project types, including if you have a DV project, right, you're going to application. It is built to accommodate all of the project types. There are individualized renewal project profiles that have been generated. I believe you all have received a sort of draft version of this already, but you'll get the final version sent to you soon. It's pre-filled with information that you will use to, and you'll be asked in the application, is this correct? You will have the opportunity to say yes or no in different places. The application has spaces, again, if you believe something to be incorrect, for you to provide a response to that or an explanation of like why you think it's incorrect. The application also shows you the point value for each criteria, but you can also use, obviously, the scoring tool for that as well. There are a lot of sort of areas where you will have a narrative throughout the application. There are character counts limits for those which have been specified this year. I believe that's change Erin made to make sure that we're responding to grantee feedback. So just be mindful, leave enough time to complete all the required narratives. And I'll talk through some of those and point out some of the things that you really need to pay attention to when you're replying to those narrative questions. The application checklist is also available, so you can look, make sure that you provide all the required documentation so that your submission is complete. And then you will have access to, you've already been sent, but it's also posted on the website, the scoring tool. I suggest as you work through an application, right, you keep the scoring tool handy so you are aware of what you're kind of shooting for in terms of what are the benchmarks, what are the thresholds, what are the things that I'm supposed to cover, the standards I'm supposed to meet when I'm completing the application. There are a few sections of the application. There are these sort of general info sections at the beginning, including a certification, grantee information, and some general renewal project information. Then we have the renewal project threshold area, which gets into the grantee financials and CoC grants management. Then the performance evaluation section, I'm going to go through most of those criteria for you, but make sure that you're using that project profile, looking at the data that's in it, and sort of attuned to where you might need to provide an explanation for something that you feel is not accurate. And then there are the narrative questions throughout, and they're again threaded throughout. I will note them, but you'll need to make sure that you respond to those. And then there are additional sections to really as resources to help you: a submissions checklist, a first-time renewal guide, operating budget template, and resources. So be sure to check out those sections if they apply to you. The only one that wouldn't apply to many of you would be the first-time renewal guide. In terms of the threshold areas, just be aware again, like these are threshold requirements. They are factored in, they're not scored, but they are considered, potentially as part of the ranking. So be aware of that and make sure you're completing the information accurately. Grantee financials, you're going to be asked about your audit, asked about liquidity, and you will need to submit an operating budget. So make sure that you leave time, in particular for the budget. The CoC grants management, we're going to ask about SAM registration and UEI, the drawdown of your funds, APR submission to HUD monitoring if that has occurred for your project, QIP participation, match, and the housing first assessment and whether you completed that earlier this year. All right, I'm going to go into more detail on the performance criteria. And I'm going to do my best to note for you where things changed from last year. So if you were the person who worked on this or a part of a team that worked on this, I'll try to flag those areas of change in particular. So there are a number of categories for the renewal project performance criteria. Really groups of criteria that have come meant to address certain things. And they include client eligibility, severity of need, centralized intake participation, CMIS participation, system performance outcomes, which is really the biggest one. Housing first, also important, supportive services, equity, inclusion, people with lived experience, additional HUD and CoC compliance, CoC grant management, and CoC participation. So trying to spread the points across a wide range of areas so that you're not simply evaluated on, your performance outcomes, but we're looking at a whole view of how your project is performing. All projects have a 100-point base, so it doesn't all the project types, it's all been sort of equalized so everybody's on the same footing in terms of the points you're eligible for. This is what the scoring tool looks like. Hopefully you've taken a look at it, but this is the summary. And again, you'll see that you can sort of look at whether you're a scattered site, PSH, or site-based, rapid, transitional housing to rapid, transitional housing, or if you're a DV, have a DV project. And each and every criteria shows the point values for each project type. And then there's also more detail provided. And as you can see on the second page, everybody's at 100 point base. If there is a criteria that doesn't apply to you, it gets pulled out of your base. So just be aware of that. But these are all the criteria that fit into the different categories. In terms of what has the most weight, just be aware system performance does have the most weight, followed by housing first, which is 12% of the points, and then CMIS participation. And then we're sort of scattered in different areas. So just be thoughtful about completing your narratives, because all the points do add up. While system performance is a huge portion, there are a lot of points in lots of different areas, and you want to do well across the board. Erin does a breakout of the objective versus subjective criteria. So most of the criteria are objective, but we do have some narratives that will be reviewed. And then there's also a look at the criteria related to the CoC's priorities, which is 10%, and then CoC compliance, which is 13%. Major changes, really nothing hugely different this year. This is really about like changing point values on the margins in a lot of ways. Instead of, there was a sort of big reshuffling, recategorization last year, not much change in that area this year. And the biggest change I will say is that probably the severity of need criteria combined together was worth 4 points, now worth 8 points in total. So just be aware of that has added weight to it this year. And then little changes: supportive services approach increased from 3 to 4 points, lease occupancy, agreement compliance, and termination and appeals compliance, each were worth 1 point, now both worth 2 points. And then some of them, the criteria had reduced point values from last year to accommodate these increases. So that includes non-cash mainstream benefits, support services capacity, fair housing, and equal access. What happened here is these two were two separate criteria. They've been combined into one. So while combined they were worth 4 points last year, it's now just 2 points because they're combined into one. Drawdown of funds was reduced, and as was the CoC voting member quarterly meeting attendance and CoC events and training attendance, overall reduced. So I'm going to go into the different sections, and I'm going to try to just point out some of the changes that have been made so you're aware. Client eligibility has 5 parts that we look at: literal homeless status, chronic homeless status, disability status, active DV status, and client eligibility compliance. I'll note that literal homeless status is NA for DV, and instead we look at active DV status, which applies only to DV projects. So just be aware of that. And then for literal homeless status, the way it's set up is that the point values are different for PSH versus the rapid TH and TH to RH. And then the chronic homeless status applies only to PSH. So that's where we make up those points. So just be aware of all those little things. Disability status also only applies to PSH. So if you're a rapid TH or TH to RH, you're really focused on this literal homeless status one. If you're a PSH, you're looking at literal, chronic, and disability status. Okay, so that was a mouthful, but I also want to note that literal homeless status has more partial point options this year. And then chronic homeless status, just note that the upper threshold is now 95%. It was 90%. And the lower threshold was 80%, but it's now 75%. So little changes here and there on the margins with these. Disability status, no change. Active DV status used to be just all or nothing, 100% or none, but now we have 100% and then a partial point option for 90 to 99%. Client eligibility compliance, no change there. In terms of client eligibility compliance, what are you going to be evaluated on? Just be aware that you're going to be asked whether you have written policies and procedures that address client eligibility, and then you're expected that they address certain aspects of client eligibility, including the things that are listed in the application. So make sure you're reading through that. Make sure that when you identify the policies and procedures section that you're pointing everyone to, that they actually address the issues that are required to be addressed. And you're also asked to describe the process for eligibility verification. And so make sure that you're providing accurate description and make sure that your description touches upon each of the things that the CoC is looking for. Severity of need, I mentioned this was only 4 points last year, so a total of 8 points this year, 2 points for each one of these. We look at unsheltered status, no income status, disability status, and DV history. Unsheltered status, the upper threshold was 30%, now 40%. And there are more partial point options, so just be aware of that. No income status, the upper threshold was 25%, now 30%. So again, as it's worth more points, more partial point options, but some of the upper benchmarks have been sort of moved up. Same with disability status, it was 50%, now 60%. The lower was 25%, it's now 20%. So just be aware of that. And then DV history was upper threshold of 10%, now 30%. The lowest was 5%, now it's 10%. So some changes there. So again, when you're reviewing your data and thinking about whether you think you've earned points, right, just be aware of the changes. This is all laid out in the scoring tool. So not just here on these slides, but within the scoring tool, all of this is stated. Centralized intake participation. We're going to look at CI referral and CI compliance. It's a total of 3 points, 2 points for CI referral, 1 for CI compliance. CI referral, the upper threshold used to be 80% to 100%, now 95%. So just be aware of that. And the lower was 60%, now 75%. The other change here, and I didn't note this on an earlier slide, but I meant to note where this applies to heads of households. The same, there are other, let me move back. Because I wanted to go under client eligibility. Some of these are now adult heads of households where they used to be adults. So just be aware of that change as well when you're looking at the data that is sent to you. Be aware of who the student universe is that you're looking at and where there might have been a change from adults to adult heads of households. All right, one more. All right, CI referrals, again, changes in the benchmarks, and then CI compliance. Again, we're going to be looking at those written policies and procedures and whether your materials are consistent and meeting the requirements that the CoC is looking for. So make sure, again, that when you identify those policies and procedures, you want to make sure that they're meeting these requirements and that you're pointing the CoC in the right direction. So in terms of centralized intake compliance, they're going to want to see a process for informing centralized intake of openings, a statement that the project fills all open spaces with CI referrals unless otherwise waived, and the process to engage the referred household and complete the intake as quickly as possible, a protocol for tracking and responding to referrals, and then protocols for rejecting referrals, right? Including the reasons why you might be able to reject a referral, timeline, and how you're going to communicate with centralized intake staff about that. So make sure that that is all covered in your policies and procedures. CMIS participation is worth 10 points in total. A little bit of a marginal change here, really. There used to be 16 data elements. HUD combined a couple of them in the new APR version, the 2024 version. So now there are 15. The lower benchmark used to be 10, now it's 12. So again, look through your error rate, but make sure if you find something to be incorrect that you're sort of on target there. Timeliness has changed a little bit. So timeliness used to be combined entries and exits, and now they're separate. 1 point for entries, 1 point for exits. The upper threshold was 75% to 100%. So now 60%, so a little more generous on timeliness. The lower was 50%, now 40%. So again, a little more generous on the timeliness. And then CMIS compliance, again, the same thing, a review of your program materials, asking about those policies and procedures, and then whether the policies and procedures meet the requirements. What are we looking for here? That your policies and procedures talk about the frequency of your data quality review. It should be monthly at least, a description of the reports that are used for that data quality review, process of how you utilize the data quality review to actually improve your project's data quality, and how the project informs clients of their privacy rights as pertains to personally identifiable information, or PII, and documents a CMIS release of information. So making sure that your policies and procedures meet those requirements. All right, system performance outcomes. This is a biggie. We're 30 points in total. And here there are 3 of them on the slide, 3 more on the next slide. Some, again, tweaks on the margins here more than anything else. And then just note that some of these do not apply to all projects. In particular, length of time to housing is scattered site PSH, rapid, TH to rapid, and DV. Length of stay only TH, and we'll cover more in the next slide. But some of these offset each other, so just be aware of whether these apply to your project type or not. Housing stability. Biggest change here is that the upper threshold was 80%. Now it's 95%. And the lower threshold was 60, and it's now 75%. And honestly, most projects probably do a pretty good job, particularly PSH, of retaining existing participants and exiting folks to permanent housing. This is a big deal for HUD, a big deal for the CoC to make sure that people are exited to permanent housing. Length of time to housing, likewise, HUD really highly emphasizes the length of time folks are experiencing homelessness, wants to see CoCs driving that down. In turn, CoCs really want to see that all of the projects are moving folks into housing quickly. So for those of you that have a project type that this applies to, this used to be a little more complicated. It was 30, 60, 180 days. Now it's 30, 60, 90 days. And it used to be 20% in 30 days and 40% in 60 days and 60% in 180 days. Now it's 50% each of those markers. So 50% of participants housed in 30 days, 50% housed in 60, 50% housed in 90 days will get you different points. So you get the most points, right, for housing at least half of the folks in 30 days. So that's kind of how this one is structured, a little bit of a change just in terms of all of that. No changes to length of stay. Still the expectation of 180 days length of stay for leavers up to a year, and you can earn points. The next set of system performance related outcomes are increased or maintained income. Everyone's favorite, I'm sure, utilization rate, and then system performance narrative, which is CoC priority. So in terms of income, again, increased or maintained income, we're looking for data from the annual assessment or exit assessment. So I implore everyone to always make sure your staff are completing those annual and exit assessments. During program assessments do not count for this, in case folks are wondering, only the annual or the exit. The no real change here other than an additional partial point option was added in. So it used to be, I think, 630, now it's 631 1.5 and 0. So just be aware that there was a little bit of a change in there. Utilization, again, applies only to site-based PSH and transitional housing. So just be aware of that. If you're scattered site, it doesn't apply to you. And different point values for the site-based PSH versus the transitional housing project types. So again, be aware of that. The lower threshold here was 50%, now 60%, that's the only change. System performance narrative, again, you're going to want to make sure that you write strong narratives for here. You can get partial points for sort of demonstrating that you have some strategies or practices in place, but you'll get the full point value if you have a strong narrative that shows that you've implemented proven strategies and practices that promote positive system performance outcomes. What specifically does that mean? Really looking for the strategies, methods, or practices that the project utilizes related to reducing the length of time homeless, preventing returns to homelessness, and increasing participant income. So those are the three big areas. And there's sort of clues as to what you should include in your narrative provided. So make sure you read through that and are sort of developing a narrative that's responsive to the questions and the prompts. Housing first. Again, no real changes to this one. It is worth 12 points. Housing first, very important. So just be aware of that. The way this works is most of the points are in housing first fidelity, 2 points in housing first narrative, 10 points in fidelity. So the CoC is going to look to see whether you have written policies and procedures, and then going to look at specific areas related to housing first, including housing first access, housing first termination, and housing first retention. So just be aware of those three core areas that you're going to be asked about, and make sure that your policies and procedures are aligned with those. And then the narrative, again, put forth your best effort to talk about you're implementing specific and relevant strategies and practices that clearly align with housing first. If you kind of show it, you'll get partial point, 1 point. But you really want to probably earn the 2 points. In terms of what it means for access, termination, and retention, again, housing first access, project access, entry assistance, and housing placement are not contingent on, and everything possible is done to avoid denying, rejecting potential participants. There's a list provided. It goes into more detail about that. This is what you're shooting for. Termination, again, you're not terminating or evicting participants solely on the basis of, and there's a list, and you'll read through it. And then housing first retention, you avoid termination or eviction back into homelessness when possible and has processes in place. And then there's a whole list of things that you should be doing. So make sure you're reading through those, look at your policies and procedures, make sure that you're addressing those issues when it comes to housing first fidelity. The narrative, this is where you're going to be asked a little more detail about how your staff are trained and educated, how the project's intake and assessment processes are flexible and lower barriers, how supportive services are tenant driven, focused on participant needs and preferences, prioritize rapid housing placement and stabilization, and how participants are educated at project entry and during tenancy about their rights. So it's a lot to cover. Again, make sure you give yourself time, be thoughtful about your responses, and make sure they address all of the areas. Supportive services. So this was, I'm sorry, it says 10 points. It's actually 8 points. That should be changed. So now worth 8 points. The areas covered are non-cash mainstream benefits, health insurance, support service capacity, and support service approach. Be aware that benefits and health insurance, like income, are dependent on the annual assessment or exit assessment information that has been input into your CMIS system. Non-cash mainstream benefits, I'll note, was worth 2 points, now 1. So a reduced point value there. The lowest threshold was 30%, now 40%. So that's the biggest change there. Health insurance, the upper threshold was 70%, now 80%. And the lower one was 50, now 60. So just be aware of that. Support service capacity, this is only 1 point, it was 3 points. So just be aware. What will happen is the CoC will review, the funding committee and the lead will review the budget, the supporting documentation, and narrative response. Supportive services, again, you want to show that they're sufficiently or appropriately funded by either the CoC grant or another funding source or a leverage. So that's what you're really trying to demonstrate there. And then the approach is going to be our narratives. The approach here is worth actually 6 points for DV projects. So if you're a DV project, be aware of that. And again, you're again trying to demonstrate that you've done like the best you can, right? Effective and appropriate supportive services. If it seems semi-effective, semi-appropriate, you can get half of the points. This is worth 4 points. It was worth 3 points last year. There are a bunch of questions here under the supportive service approach narrative. I will again urge folks to leave enough time to complete the narrative responses and not rush through it. Again, you're really going to be called upon to talk about things like how participants receive services and support, how often case managers meet with the participants, how case manager ensures the client has access to things like health insurance and healthcare services, how case managers ensure clients have access to things like non-cash mainstream benefits like SNAP, WIC, etc. Describe any additional services that are provided. And then projects serving households with children only are asked about the educational rights, how families are informed about that. DV projects are going to be asked about best practices within serving the survivors of domestic violence, including trauma-informed victim-centered approaches and those kinds of things. So if you're in one of those buckets, be aware you have extra questions to answer. Equity and inclusion is 8 points. It was worth 10 points, so now 8. And that is primarily because fair housing and equal access have been combined into a single criteria where they used to be 2 separate ones. But there's, I don't know, a lot of overlap here, right? So these have been now combined into a single one. Make sure though, when you're reading through the compliance questions, you're aware of you're needing to meet both of those. Again, we're going to be looking at whether the project has the written policies and procedures and whether they meet the requirements, and the same with the anti-discrimination. A project has the written policies and procedures, doesn't meet the requirements. The requirements are laid out. So the other part of the equity and inclusion includes racial justice and equity, and then the disability rights narrative. So just, again, be aware of the language. The questions haven't really changed substantively. There's been some tweaking of sort of the thresholds, and just for clarity's sake. So again, you want to demonstrate that you're implementing strategies and practices that, in this case, promote racial equity and cultural competence, including language access, and work to actively identify and address disparities and barriers. So that's a really callback to the questions that HUD poses within the NOFO itself around identifying barriers and addressing barriers. So that's really been the focus, and that's the question that you're asked to answer. Disability rights, again, you're going to be asked for a narrative, demonstrate the project implements strategies and practices that promote equal access to and utilization of housing and services for persons with disabilities. So again, plan to answer all of these narratives. In terms of the fair housing and equal access compliance, here's the sort of first part of it. As I noted, you have like the fair housing part, which hasn't changed from prior years. So if you were compliant in prior years, hopefully you're compliant this year. And then the equal access part has been added as well. Just be aware that there's an extra requirement for projects that serve households with children, and to ensure that families aren't separated, right? So just make sure you're reading through those and able to point to the appropriate places in your policies and procedures. Anti-discrimination compliance is that's a lot simpler. You're aligned with the CoC's anti-discrimination policy, and you inform clients of their anti-discrimination rights, including how to file a formal complaint. So that's anti-discrimination. And then disability rights. again, describe how this project takes steps to ensure effective communication with current and prospective participants with disabilities, to ensure that the admissions process and all services are accessible. Describe how the project offers accessible opportunities to request reasonable accommodations, and how the project provides services in the most integrated setting possible. So those are the three core areas to look at in the disability rights. People with lived experience, this is worth 4 points. Minor, again, tweaks in terms of the language, just to simplify. There's a look at consumer participation compliance, whether you meet sort of HUD's requirement of having a person with lived experience participate either on the board or an equivalent policymaking entity. So we're looking for documentation there around that. Do you have that person participating on such an entity or your board? And then incorporating people with lived experience narrative. This is a CoC priority. So again, you're going to be asked to write a narrative about sort of how you incorporate people with lived experience in the project, agency, community planning, feedback, and decisions on homeless services and solutions. So you can get partial points, but obviously you want to be doing your best to engage people with lived experience so that you get the full points. This is really broken out into a few different areas. So be prepared again to respond to these questions, describing how you engage people with lived experience in project planning and decision-making, how that you routinely gather feedback from people with lived experience, and the steps the project takes to address concerns raised by those persons. Describe how the project actively provides professional development and employment opportunities to people with lived experience, and how the project or organization actively encourages current and former participants to involvement in efforts to prevent and end homelessness. And there's some examples given of what that might look like. So 4 sort of different takes on that sort of general category, things that your agency should be working on when it comes to engaging people with lived experience. All right, additional HUD and CoC requirements. This one has increased in point value, just to be aware, was worth 2 points. Now it's 4 points. I actually didn't update those. These should be 2 and 1 and 2. No, 1 and 1, that's right. 1 and 1, 1 and 1. So I did update them. The project is compliant with HUD CoC program lease, sublease, or occupancy agreement requirements. So just be aware your lease, sublease, or occupancy agreements are being reviewed pretty carefully. And they're going to be looking at those to make sure that 1, you have one in place where that's appropriate, and 2, that it meets the requirements that are outlined in the application. And then termination and appeals, again, the same thing. Want to make sure you're compliant with the termination and appeals requirements, that you have a termination and appeals sort of process, right? And that it meets the requirements and doesn't sort of run afoul of things. In terms of the lease occupancy agreement compliance, just be aware that there are sort of like different things that are being looked at depending on the type of project you have. So if you have a PSH project, it's a little different from, say, a TH or THRH or an RRH. So make sure that you are reading through these and really truly understand sort of like what the expectation is around your project type and sort of the thresholds that you're asked to meet. And termination and appeals compliance. Again, we want to make sure that you have such a policy and procedure in place, right? And a termination appeals process. And that it doesn't sort of run roughshod over the participants' rights. So you want to have a formal process. You want to provide a process for providing written notice to the participant and a reason for the termination, process for the participant to present written or oral objections to somebody other than the person who made the who approved the termination. Outlines a process for prompt written notice of the final decision to the program participant. Ensure the program participants are provided with a written copy of the program rules and termination process before they begin to receive assistance. And then for PSH only, define the difference between program termination and eviction. So they're clear what it means to be evicted versus what it means to be terminated from the program. Grant management. We are almost at the end, folks. Yay. Grant management, couple of things to note. It was worth 5 points, now 4, because drawdown was worth 3 points, now 2, although the standards really haven't changed here. So note that you need to draw down at least 97% of your funds to get points. Anything other than that is actually considered you're not in compliance. 100% of your funds to get full points. Looking at the FY21 CoC grant that you had. So we're looking back in time because we want to look at a grant that's fully completed. And so this year, looking at FY21. And then cost effectiveness, looking at project cost per client and per permanent housing outcome. And really looking at the cost per permanent housing outcome. If you're in the top 20%, top 40%, or top 60%. So you'll get the most points if you're in the top 20%, and at 1 point if you're in the top 40, and a half a point if you're in the top 60. Used to kind of be just, I think, in the top 40%, added another partial point option here. All right, CoC participation. This one used to be worth 6 points. No, it was 4 points, and now it's 3 points. And that's because training attendance was worth 2, now just 1. So each one is worth 1 point. You'll just want to make sure that the CoC membership attendance records are accurate. When you get your project profile, just review that and make sure that what you think is what you had in place during the year aligns with what the CoC has. And that includes having a voting member, right? And then having the voting member attend meetings, and then attending a certain number of the events and trainings. So just be aware of, hopefully you have good records on your own. And that's it for me, thankfully. My throat's a little parched, but if anybody had any questions, happy to take them. I'll keep my slide deck up in case anybody had any questions. I need to navigate back to anything. Anything come up, Erin? Nope. Were there any things that I didn't cover that you thought should be?
You did a fantastic job, as always. Thank you.
Okay, so that was a lot. Hopefully it helped folks to have us go through them, point out some of the changes from last year. And with that, I will turn it over to Erin.
So I'm just going to share my screen. We will still be continuing to monitor the chat throughout. So if you guys have any questions for Kirsty or for me while I'm going through my slides, please feel free to put them in there and we will get to them. I'm not gonna take up too much additional time from you guys. We're just gonna go over some general overview information and then some specifics for how you guys are going to submit your applications this year. So first, we're just going to give a NOFO update. So in terms of HUD's competition processes, the grants inventory worksheet for this year has not been released yet, but we do anticipate that coming out soon. And the grants inventory worksheet is a list of all of our current renewal grants that are based off of our most recent contracts. So the fiscal year 23 contracts, which are currently in process, that are eligible to apply for renewal funding for this competition. So it's all of our projects that are currently operating that can apply for renewal projects this year. We also anticipate the release of the fiscal year 24 NOFO in early July. HUD is operating on a relatively consistent timeline this year. So we anticipate it being within the same time frame that it was released last year. But we will make sure to provide a specific notice to everyone when more official information comes out from HUD. The NOFO itself will be the notification that we received confirmation for new funding availability. So we did recently put out the notice of intent for people who might potentially be interested in applying for new project funding. So when the NOFO is released, that's when we will know for sure if new project funding is going to be available through the NOFO this year. And as Christine mentioned a little earlier, there is or has been a 2-year NOFO approved. And I'm just gonna kick it back to her for 2 seconds to provide just kind of a brief overview on the information that we do have about that.
So this was exciting news within the HUD appropriations from Congress that they approved HUD to issue a 2-year CoC program NOFO, and HUD has to get their approval for this kind of thing. So they finally put it in there. We don't really know what it means. We have been told, HUD staff have said in other sort of public settings that they do intend to issue a 2-year NOFO. It could mean that the CoC needs to only do everything this year and everything will carry over next year, meaning you will all work on your project applications, everything will get put through, and then whatever is funded gets funded again in FY25 without having to do an application. That seems a little bit unlikely. The likelihood is that you might have to do some kind of project application. It might also be that the CoCs are asked to do a full ranking next year. We don't know. We won't know until the NOFO is released. But the suggestion is for all of you to keep in mind that this might be your only opportunity to apply for funds for the CoC program for the next 2 years. So if you are interested in new funds, or you just want to make a change to your renewal, this is probably the year to go forward and do it. So keep that in mind, put your best foot forward with your renewal as well. And I would say that in any case, but that's kind of where we're at with this 2-year NOFO.
Awesome. Thank you, Christy. So we will let you guys know when we get more official information from HUD. So this year's funding committee, which Christy went through kind of a brief overview of all of their responsibilities, are listed here. We do every year we try to make sure that the funding committee is representative of several different sectors and subpopulations, and there's a couple return people on the list, and there's also a couple new people on the list this year. And we just thank the committee for all of the work that they put in each year to this process. It is pretty comprehensive, and they spend a lot of time going through all the different applications and materials and with scoring. So thank you to the committee this year. We have a couple members on meeting today, and this is also available on the CoC webpage as well. For our renewal grantees, we have 10 different organizations that currently receive renewal project funding. They're all listed here. We have 2 new organizations from last year, which include Family Promise of Southern Delaware and Newcastle County. We have been working over the last couple of years to broaden the number of organizations that receive CoC funding. So it's excited to see that there's new people coming in the past several years. A couple important dates and deadlines. So Today is the mandatory renewal applicant information meeting, where you guys get all of the information you need to know to submit your local applications. Today is also the deadline for the fiscal year 24 data quality period. So at 4:00 p.m. today, all renewal grantees should have all of their CMIS data corrections or any errors and anything like that taken care of by 4:00, because we will be finalizing the APRs and running those between tomorrow and the next day to finalize your profiles for the applications. And I have some more information about that on later slides. But please, if there's any last minute information or any last minute assistance that you need in order to finalize your data for this year's competition, please reach out to us as soon as possible. Preferably right after the meeting if you need anything from us for that. We will be going into the application submission period, and we do have some TA meetings that are going to be available for that. I have more detailed information on another slide, particularly about how you can schedule those. But we do offer specific application TA. This year, your guys' applications for the local process are going to be due on Wednesday, June 26th at 4:00 p.m. And that is when access to your submission folder will be removed. And so all materials need to be completed and uploaded by that time for your evaluations. Again, in July, this is when we anticipate the NOFO is going to be released. This is also when the funding committee will be reviewing and scoring your applications. And we also anticipate releasing the new project RFP sometime in July, which will come after the NOFO is released. In August, that's when we anticipate new project applications being due and reviewed by the committee. And that's when we anticipate final scores and ranking being completed. Then in September, if the NOFO follows the normal timeline, that's when we will anticipate the deadline for that being submitted. This is just a screenshot from one of your guys' debrief materials from last year's competition that covers a summary of all of the major pieces of the process and the time frame in which they occurred. We are operating on just about the same timeline currently as we did last year, and we're anticipating and hoping that we're going to continue to operate on the same timeline. But this is just, again, a summary review for your guys' reference on kind of a general idea of when the different parts of the renewal process occur. For your guys' renewal project materials, I am going to review, just reiterate some of the information Christy went over for you guys. But the main materials that you will be using for your applications are the renewal project profiles, the renewal project application, and the renewal project scoring tool. So the renewal project profiles take information from a bunch of different data sources and kind of combine all of your guys' current grant information and calculates your performance outcomes for the data metrics that you'll be evaluated on. You will then use those to help complete the renewal project applications. Again, like Christy said, the applications have additional narratives and other information that you need to complete. But from the profiles and from the applications, that will complete your full performance and threshold evaluations for the year. And that's what will be reviewed against the scoring tool to create your guys' final scores. And then this is just a brief overview of the different sections and forms that are part of the application. It is set up very similarly to the way that it was last year, and there were not a lot of major changes. And then just for the renewal project scoring tool, the first couple pages of the tool is just a point summary. So it's a brief reference to all of the different breakdowns and totals for each metric. And then the metric and benchmark detail is in the later pages of the tool, so that you can really see the detailed information about each metric that you're being evaluated on. Just again, a summary of the major changes that were made to the application this year, or the materials as well. So in your project profiles themselves, we added the outcome calculation information. And I have a screenshot on this next slide that shows what that looks like and what I mean by that. But it just kind of plainly outlines exactly how the data is being calculated to create the outcomes that you guys are scored against. We added question type indicators and response character limits this year to the application. That was direct feedback from a couple of you guys last year, just to help you better gauge like what is involved with answering each question. We consolidated some of the threshold questions around your financial audit and your monitoring. That was just to reduce some redundancy, but the information that was being asked has not changed. And there was the addition of 2 new threshold questions. There was the housing first assessment. We let you guys know when you completed that, that making sure that it was completed and submitted on time would be part of threshold for the competition this year. But the content of that is not being scored or evaluated. And we also added a question in relation to the match that's submitted with your most recently completed APR, which will be the fiscal year 21 grant term. So when you guys dive into the application, the indicators will be right here. So if it's a yes, no question, it'll say yes, no. If it's a narrative question or a question that requires you to add any additional information, you'll see the character limits there. When we were turning this into a PDF, I did test boxes to make sure that the character limits fit within those text boxes. But if you guys have any issues when you're completing it, or it's not allowing you to reach the character limit, just let us know. So that way we can make sure that you're able to answer all of the questions effectively. And when we talk about the outcome calculation being added to the profiles for each performance metric under the row in which you'll see what the metric is and where the outcome will be calculated, you can see that there's a calculation row now. So it lays out the like which metrics or which information is being calculated. So this guy or over this guy, and then it also includes where in the APR that information is being pulled from. And you can see which piece, which section of the APR again is being calculated. So this is just also to allow you guys to be able to calculate your own outcomes in the event that we aren't able to provide any updated information. You guys can run your APRs at any time, and you can look at what your outcomes are for these metrics at any time, because the calculations, the exact calculations that we use for scoring this year are included in there for you. So your renewal project data, so all project data for the applications is provided through the project profiles. And this is the 3rd year that we are using this process. The feedback that we've gotten each time is that it's really helpful and you guys want to continue doing it this way. So that's why we're doing it this way again this year. This year's performance period, so the data that's being evaluated is 4/1/23 to 3/31/24. And again, the data quality period deadline is today at 4 o'clock. So that is your last chance to make any last minute corrections or try to improve any of your outcomes for the metrics that are being scored. We will be running your APRs between 8 a.m. tomorrow and 4 p.m. on Friday. You guys are not permitted to make any changes to your renewal project data in CMAS until after 4 on Friday, at which time you guys can resume normal data entry. That is just to allow us time to make sure that we are able to run the final APRs and that there's no discrepancies between what is on the final APR that we run and the final APR that you guys see. We will be providing those final APRs and the project profiles to you guys no later than Monday at 4 p.m. We are going to try our best to get it to you guys by Friday, but in the event that we're not able to do that, the latest you'll receive those is on Monday, and that's when your submission period will start. And again, the final project profiles are what, again, you use to complete the applications. For your Google Drive submission, so we will be giving you access to your submission folder that will include the profiles on the APRs and blank applications no later than Monday at 4 o'clock. You guys will have full access to upload, download, and edit the materials that are included in the drive, but please let us know as soon as possible if you guys have any issues with using the drive. Please do not wait until the last minute to let us know if you're having issues with the drive itself. We want to make sure that you guys are able to submit all of your materials as easily as possible. So please let us know and check as soon as possible if you're having any issues once we give you the access to the drive folder. And we've also set up the folders to help with you organizing the materials that we'll touch base on in the next slide. So we will go through kind of how that's set up to help you guys this year. And once the deadline for application submission occurs, we will be removing access to the submission folder specifically. It is set up in your guys's just regular provider folders. We won't be taking access away to all of your materials that are in there, just the submission folder. And that's just during the time frame in which they're being reviewed. The Google Drive submission also does not apply to victim service providers due to data and privacy concerns. So we will be handling that process separately through email, and our providers that utilize that process are familiar with the way that we go about that. So this is for all non-victim service provider submissions. There's a lot of text on this page, and I'm not going to read it all, but we did also create a Google Drive navigation guide to help you guys with your submissions this year, which are in the folders, and we'll send them out to you as well. So it just outlines how the folder is organized, which documents are already included, and where to upload your additional submission documents. It's not an exhaustive list of all of the required documentation, and it's only intended to help you with navigating the folder. The submission checklist in the actual application is what has the comprehensive list of all of the documentation that you need to submit with your application. So the submission folder itself has 3 main subfolders and might have a couple more depending on how many renewal projects you have. So the first things that are included are your individual project folders, which will be named by your project PIN and then the project name. These folders will include your final APR, profile, and a blank application. And you will utilize the individual project folders to submit the final completed application for that project, the project's operating budget, and any additional project-specific documentation. So the individual project folders are really only for any documentation or materials that pertain particularly to that renewal project. All of the individual project folders are set up exactly the same way and will include the same base materials in them. So that's if you have multiple projects. There's also a grantee/agency attachments folder. So this is for uploading all of the documentation that applies to just the agency overall or applies to multiple projects. You do not need to submit your financial audit over and over and over again. If you had multiple projects on quality improvement, you don't need to submit that final document multiple times. Anything that is kind of applicable to multiple projects or across the provider can go into just that folder. There's no subfolders included in there. You guys are able to add folders or name your materials and organize that as you see fit. And then finally, there's the program materials folder. So this is for all program materials, even if it's project specific. There's a quite a variation in how the organizations do their project materials in terms of what is applicable to the entire organization and what is applicable just to the CoC project. So instead of trying to navigate whether you're supposed to put it in the individual project folder or the grantee attachment folder, any and all program materials that'll be used for the compliance evaluation, just throw in the one folder. And again, you guys can create additional subfolders to organize that as needed. But if you're not creating any additional folders in there, just make sure that any project specific documentation is labeled to or for the project that it applies to. You guys will also have a couple individual documents in there, just the profile template and key, and also the final approved scoring tool. These are available on the website, but we threw them in here just for ease of access as you guys are completing the applications as well. So these are just a couple screenshots of a test folder that I set up just to show you guys. So within your funding cycle folder, this is the same folder that you guys access your data quality materials. There's now just a new folder in there for the application submission. You can also see the funding policies easily and the navigation guide for reference. Once you click into your submission folder, you'll see your individual project folders, the grantee attachments, the program materials, the template key and the scoring tool. And then within the individual project folders, when we give you guys access, you'll see your final APR, your final project profile, and a blank application. We went ahead and threw them in all of the individual project folders just for ease of you guys being able to complete them instead of having to download and re-upload, but you have full access to edit that, so you don't have to edit that one in the folder if you don't want to. It's just there to make it easier for you guys to do so. Christy went over this a little bit earlier, but there are, we differentiated between what is a first-time renewal and what's a second-time renewal this year, which was a little ambiguous in prior years. So first-time renewals are projects that were awarded last year. So this is their first time going through the renewal process. The first-time renewals aren't scored, but you do still have to answer application questions and submit documentation. So you definitely want to make sure that you are reviewing the first and second time renewal guide to understand what you have to do for the application. Second time renewals for projects that were awarded 2 competitions ago. So that would be fiscal year 22. And all of those projects that were awarded in 2 prior competitions, fiscal year 22, we're required to start operating as of January 1st of this year, but they haven't completed a full performance period, so you guys still aren't subject to a full evaluation. But again, there are questions and documentation that you do have to submit, and then there may be some aspect of scoring as determined by the committee, but that will be determined later on as it is appropriate. This doesn't really apply to, it only applies to 1 project this year, but we will communicate that directly. This is just a screenshot directly from the guide that gives you a little bit more detail on how to identify if you have a first or a second time renewal. And I do apologize, there is a small typo. This should be 1231, not 1221. And then this is just a summary overview of the information that's included up there. So other supplemental forms in the application. So there's the submission checklist. And again, there's a hyperlinked table of contents in the applications. So you don't have to do a ton of scrolling, but it's on page 34 and 35. Again, it is a comprehensive overview of all the documents that you need to submit with your application. It'll also tell you which ones are required only if it applies, and if there's any optional things that you can submit for supporting documentation for narratives and things like that. There is an operating budget template. So everybody has to submit an operating budget for each project. Use of the template's optional, but if you guys don't use it, you just have to make sure that the operating budget that you submit meets all of the requirements that are listed in the application. So the budget or the template's just there to make it easier. If you want to use that, you don't have to, but you still have to meet all of the requirements with the budget that you do submit. Then there's an application and scoring resources. These are just live links to a bunch of different resources that will help provide more information about a ton of different things in the application. It's there again just as a something that makes it easier for you guys to look up more information if you need to. As a side note, you guys should also be revisiting your debrief materials from last year. We provided a summary overview for things that applied to everybody's applications. We also provided some specific detailed feedback per provider and per organization. But this is feedback and recommendations for how you can improve on this year's applications. So you should be revisiting those and using those also as resources to help you complete your applications this year. For application TA, so we're offering 3 different days with a bunch of different times for application submission TA in particular. It is not for another 2 weeks. So the first day that we're providing is June 14th. Then we are also providing the 17th and the 21st. We did make these a little bit later in the submission period because the hope is that you guys will have reviewed all of the materials and started your applications before you go through a TA meeting. We want to make sure that that time is used as effectively as possible and that we are providing as much of a resource as we can to help answer any questions or any detailed information that's really going to help you submit your application or improve upon the quality of your application. We do not recommend utilizing this time if you haven't looked at the application or started it yet. So please try to make a teensy bit of a dent in the materials before we schedule TA. But with that being said, we do really highly encourage it because again, we are here as a resource to help you guys with this process, and we want to make sure that you are utilizing that resource. You can schedule with us using the link and it'll automatically send the Zoom and the calendar invite. And if you guys aren't available or need to request a different time that's not included in the calendar link, you can do that. However, please make sure you do that as soon as possible because our availability isn't guaranteed outside of the dates and times that are offered here. And we can't guarantee that we'll be able to provide TA on short notice. So please review that, schedule it as soon as possible. And if you're not available during the times that we're offering, please let us know as soon as possible so that we can get an alternative date and time scheduled for you guys. These are just a couple screenshots from the CoC funding page. So all of the renewal project materials that are currently published are available on the funding page. And then once we process today's recording and the slides and things like that, we will replace the information here with that. So all of today's materials will also be available publicly on the funding page for you guys to access at any time. And this is where all other public notifications will appear for the different parts of the funding process. Last slide, just want to reiterate that the application submission deadline is Wednesday, June 26th at 4:00 p.m. That's when we will be removing your submission folder access and any late or incomplete applications don't meet threshold. And so that is a bit of an issue. So please make sure that everything that you need to submit is uploaded and ready to go as of 4:00 p.m. on the 26th. Just again, to reiterate, all of the materials from today and anything else that's been publicly published is going to be available on the funding page, and we will be giving you access to the drive and sending you your final materials no later than Monday at 4:00. And then any other questions, issues, concerns, anything like that can be directed both to Jessica and myself throughout the process. So we will be available to you guys as needed for any questions or any that you need for completing the applications. That is it for me. Does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns, anything that we can answer for you right now while we are all together? I'm not seeing anybody unmute, and I don't see anything in the chat so far. So we just want to thank you guys for attending today, and thank you for your continued dedication to serving some of the most vulnerable populations that we have in our state. We really appreciate your guys' time and effort that you put into this process, and that you put into serving all of your participants. We hope you have a great rest of the week, and if you have any questions or need anything from us, please feel free to reach out.